Hi everyone, this is Meredith with Fortitude Immigration Consulting, and I just wanted to do a short video with respect to some questions about temporary status in Canada. So we're going to start off with temporary status as a worker tied to an LMIA, which is considered a closed work permit. So if you're here under a closed work permit tied to an employer and you quit or are terminated, a lot of people are concerned on what their status in Canada then becomes. You are allowed to stay in Canada for the duration of your work permit. So you can stay in Canada, but you cannot continue to work and you cannot study, as that work permit is closed and tied to that specific employer. Now, if you obtain a new LMIA, then you can change the conditions of your work permit, but you cannot work for that new employer until the new work permit has been issued under that new LMIA. You are, however, allowed to claim unemployment in Canada if you meet Service Canada's regulations in order for you to obtain unemployment insurance, which is EI. If you are in Canada on a work permit and are terminated or you quit and you have a spouse who is here also on an open spousal work permit, they, however, are allowed to stay working under that work permit for the duration of the validity. So let's say that you're here under a work permit and you get terminated or you quit. You are no longer allowed to work, but your spouse who is on an open work permit can continue to work because their status is tied to your work permit, not to your employer. Now, if you do get a new LMIA and change the conditions of your work permit, you also need to do an extension of their status as well, because then they also need to be tied to that new work permit that you'll be changing your conditions to. If you have children here who are under student visas or student permits and are working, their status also stays and they are allowed to continue their studies in Canada tied to your original work permit until or if you change your conditions of that existing work permit. So everybody's tied to your status in Canada, but you're the only one who is no longer allowed to work or study because you are tied to specific conditions. So they can stay studying under your original work permit conditions and your spouse can stay working under their open spousal work permit. But should you make changes to your original status, you too need to change their status as well because they are tied to your original status. So let's say you're here on a work permit for 2 years. You worked for 6 months and your employer terminated you. You can stay here for the remaining term of your work permit. Now, your open work permit for your spouse is also tied to those original validation dates, so they can stay working for the term of their open spousal work permit as well. Now, let's say you're here under a study permit and you need to take a leave of absence due to medical reasons, pregnancy, you need to go home due to a death in the family, etc. If you inform your DLI, Designated Learning Institution, who you have obtained your study permit under, you are allowed to be absent for the term of their policies, obviously, but you're allowed to stay absent from studying for a maximum of 150 days. That's tied to your conditions under your study permit. Now, let's say that you are no longer interested in studying, or you're not sure what you want to do, or you're going to be absent for longer than 150 days, then you must change your conditions to either a visitor status or a worker status. Now, obviously, under worker status, you must obviously comply with the requirements in order to obtain that status, which would most likely be an LMIA, employer-driven work permit. But if you're changing the conditions to either or, you have to do so within 150 days or you are in breach of your original study permit conditions. Now, let's say that you do change your conditions to a visitor status, for example, within the 150 days, and you now decide you want to go back to school. Things have changed in your life, and your study permit, original study permit, is still valid, even though you're here under a visitor status, and you've re-enrolled into a DLI, you can continue to study under that original study permit, and your status now is still valid, even though you changed your conditions to a visitor, as long as the original study permit was still valid. Now, let's say that you're rolling into a new DLI, you have visitor status, but your original study permit is still valid, but is about to expire. As long as you extend that study permit and meet the conditions of the study permit, which obviously is enrollment documents to the new DLI, meeting the financial burdens and responsibilities of that study permit, etc., you can then do an extension of your study permit and have implied status and continue studying until your new study permit is issued. Now, if you do an extension of your visitor status before you go back to school or want to continue studying, you no longer can use that original study permit. You then would have to reapply under a new study permit and meet the conditions of a new study permit. Now, and that new study permit would also have to be done from outside of Canada. If you're here as a visitor, you cannot apply for study status or work status from within Canada. The application must be done from outside of Canada. Now, let's say that within that 150 days, you changed your status to a visitor status, but you have a spouse here that's under an open spousal work permit. They are allowed to continue working under that open spousal work permit for the duration of that status. Even though you've changed your status to a visitor, their status is still the same and they can continue working. Same with any dependent children. They can stay working under the original study permit until that original study permit expires. So even though you're here under visitor status now because you've changed the conditions, your dependent children and your open spousal work permit for your spouse are tied to your original study permit validity. Now, if that original study permit is about to expire and you are on a visitor status, you will then need to change the conditions of your spouse and your dependent children, which means your dependent children would have to apply for their own study permits, and your spouse would have to either obtain LMIA related work permit or apply for visitor status themselves and quit working. So those are just some minor information with respect to your temporary status. Remember, you're allowed to stay in Canada with valid status. So for study permits, you are allowed to stay in Canada for 150 days once you stop studying. After that, you must change your conditions or leave Canada. Open spouses are allowed to continue working under that original status. Independent children are allowed to stay studying. Now, work conditions, obviously we just talked about that, are different. An open spousal work permit can stay working, and you here as a temporary foreign worker can stay in Canada under that status. So there are some different factors in each situation. Now, there are many different questions that people might have that might be linked to your status here in Canada, and you can feel free to contact me through Facebook, through my website, or WhatsApp, and we can continue chatting about that. Or if you have more questions and you want to see them posted on YouTube videos on my channel, please feel free to let me know, and I can gather more data and knowledge and pass that on to you, of course, as well. Thank you very much for tuning into my Fortitude Immigration Consulting YouTube channel. Hope to talk to you soon. Thank you.